Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Rosa Parks mock trial. I am Rachel Alper, the bailiff and court clerk in this courtroom. Please turn off all cell phones and pagers. Okay. If I hear a phone going off, I will confiscate it. You are free to take pictures, but please do not use distracting flashes. Once the trial starts, the judge will not tolerate any talking or outbursts of emotion. I don't want to have to kick anyone out of this courtroom. Thank you. Before we begin, I would like to introduce Ty Alper to say a few words.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's great. The principal doesn't even have a seat. You're okay standing? All right. There is one seat right here, if anyone wants it. It's your chance. Thank you all for coming. It's great to have so many people here. I'm just going to say a few words to introduce a couple and thank a couple people and give you just a couple words of introduction to what you're about to see, and then we'll turn it over to the kids. But I wanted to first introduce my co-teachers, James Stevens and Rachel Alper. James and I taught the class last year. He is a practicing lawyer in Alameda County, actually all over the Bay Area. And where's Allison? He and Allison got married last weekend. And instead of being on their honeymoon, they're here with us at the Rosa Parks mock trial. So all of the kids I know are grateful to the time that James put into this, not having any kids at Rosa Parks or any connection to Rosa Parks except for having taught this class last year. And Rachel, who is an alum of Rosa Parks and of the mock trial class, taught the classes equally with me and James this year, and it was great to have her. We also had 3 other people who helped almost every week. Roxanne from Rosa Parks was with us every week. Roxanne. And then we had 2 other assistant coaches, Naomi Barrios and Zoe Pancoast. And it was really amazing to see these 6th graders teaching the 5th graders every bit as well, if not much better than James and I could do. We wanted to thank, I don't know if Shannon or Kristen are here, are they? The 2 teachers whose rooms we used all semester. They might not have made it, but I wanted to thank the other teachers who are in the room for giving us your kids for the semester and letting us pull them out a couple times during class to work with them. So can all the Berkeley teachers, even if you're not a Rosa Parks teacher, if you're a Berkeley teacher, can you stand up and let us appreciate you? And then, let me just sing, and then Paco, Principal Furlong. He's responsible for us all being here tonight because at last year's back to school night, after we did mock trial 1 year, he announced to the whole school that we were doing it again next year. He's very clever. So thank you, Paco, for forcing us to do this again this year. So just really quick, a word about the kids and what they're about to do. One thing I wanted to make sure everybody knew was that this is not a play. We didn't write out a script in the beginning of the semester and give it to them to read. We came up with a case, and I wanted to recognize Tacey. Where's Tacey? Tacey helped come up with a case. Tacey's another Rosa Parks alum. We came up with a case, and we gave it to the students, and they came up with the questions that they were going to ask and the arguments they were going to make, and we worked with them on those questions and on the arguments. But they haven't, each side, the prosecution and the defense, hasn't seen each other's arguments. They haven't gotten a chance to practice cross-examining the witnesses that they're going to cross-examine tonight. They've never done it before with these witnesses, because in real life you don't always get a chance to cross-examine the actual witnesses ahead of time. So it requires them to be able to think on their feet, solve problems, think creatively, and they really rose to the challenge. What we taught them is what we teach in this school, in this building, which is trial advocacy skills, and they picked it up as quickly as any of our law students, including James, who is my student. They were much quicker. All right, one couple other little announcements. Last year, we violated so many rules, law school rules with this event, and I'm determined to keep the violations in the single digits. So afterwards, there's going to be a reception upstairs. Please keep your kids from jumping off things and rolling around in the chairs and all sorts of, that's one of the violations that I'm hoping we can, we didn't get an alcohol permit last year. We just decided to do away with alcohol this year altogether. But no jumping around seems to be an important rule to follow. So in the trial itself, this is a courtroom, so there's no clapping, no cheering. At the end of so you have to suppress your natural desire to applaud these kids until after it's all over. So when we have the mock trial class, we talk about having courtroom rules where you get kicked out if you're talking. So we want everybody to be extremely quiet. The mics sometimes are hard to pick up they take a second to pick up. So everybody please be quiet and no clapping or cheering. And then there'll be a reception upstairs afterwards. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to Sheriff Alper.
Rise, the Honorable Demetrius Agratellis, Alameda County Superior Court presiding.
Stand up. Do you guys too?
May be seated. The clerk, please call the first case.
Now calling case number 14 CR 3419, People v. Andy McGee.
Ms. Alper, please bring in the defendant. Ms. Bayshore Walker, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Blankenhouse, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Very well. Ms. Alper, please bring in the jury. Thank you, members of the jury. The defendant in this case is Andy McGee. He's accused of committing the crime of theft. You are here to decide if Mr. McGee is guilty or not guilty. A defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires the prosecution to prove a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you very sure that the accusation is true. The evidence the prosecution presents does not have to get rid of all possible doubt, because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. It is up to you as jurors to decide which witnesses to believe. In deciding whether testimony is true and accurate, use your common sense and experience. Consider the testimony of each witness and decide how much of it you believe. Among the factors that you may consider are: how well could the witness see or hear the things about which the witness has testified? How well was the witness able to remember and describe what happened? Was the witness's testimony influenced by a personal relationship with someone involved in the case? The defendant, Mr. McGee, is charged with 1 count of theft in violation of Section 484 of the California Penal Code. To prove that the defendant is guilty of this crime, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Andy McGee, unlawfully took the personal property of another person, and that property was worth more than $250. After you hear all of the testimony and arguments in the case, you will talk amongst yourselves, which is called deliberating. You will then vote to decide whether you think Mr. McGee is guilty or not guilty. Before we begin, I would like to ask all members of the jury to make sure you do not speak, laugh, or make any noise during the trial. We want everyone to be able to concentrate on the lawyers and witnesses who are conducting the trial. Thank you for your cooperation. Let's proceed with the opening statements. Ms. Sood, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about a boy who wanted a fancy watch so badly he was willing to steal from another kid to get it. The defendant, Andy McGee, is a senior at Berkeley High. We are here today to prove that Mr. McGee stole a violin from Grace Johnson, an 8th grader at Longfellow. The crime happened at the Longfellow Theater, backstage, around 8 p.m. on February 24th, 2014. There was a music performance going on, and everyone who was not performing at that time left their instrument backstage. Grace Johnson, a Longfellow student whose dream is to be a professional violinist, left her instrument backstage with many others, thinking it would be safe. But you're going to hear that her violin was not safe. Today you will hear from Miss Johnson, the victim of the crime. You will also hear from William Brown, who, like Andy, is a student at Berkeley High. Mr. Brown is an eyewitness who will tell you about how he saw Andy, who he knew from Berkeley High, stealing the violin. He will tell you that he recognized him from his voice. You will also hear from Sam Briggs, who also goes to Berkeley High. Sam heard Andy tell his friends that he had a foolproof plan and was glad he had a brother in the Longfellow band. You will hear that Andy's brother Barry was in the band and was playing that night at the same concert as Grace Johnson. Andy McGee stole Grace Johnson's violin. It was a very expensive violin that cost $400, and Grace will tell you that it was her prized possession. Whenever she played it, she remembered her grandmother who died the previous year, because Grace was with her grandmother when she bought it. She also bought the violin with her own money, so it had a lot of sentimental value for her, so she is heartbroken that it is gone. Andy McGee did not just steal a random instrument. He knew this one was expensive. That's why he stole it, because as Sam Briggs will tell you, he had a plan. After hearing the evidence of this case, you will know that he followed through on that plan, and you will know that he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sood. Ms. Perelic, would the defense like to make an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, you are here today because a young girl named Grace Johnson has had her violin stolen. But in fact, this is a case about an innocent boy who wasn't even in the auditorium when Grace's violin was stolen. You have heard reasons why you should accuse Andy McGee. Now you will hear many more reasons why Andy McGee is actually innocent. The witnesses will all testify that Andy McGee might not have the best behavior, but he didn't have any reason to steal the violin. His grandfather had recently won a lottery and given Andy and his brother Barry $500 each to spend on whatever they wanted. That would be enough money to buy the new watch that Andy wanted and have some money left. Another thing that you will hear is that Andy was seen at the restaurant Supermania on Saturday, February 24, 2014, which is the exact time that he was blamed for stealing the violin. While you are listening to this testimony, think about both places, the Longfellow Auditorium and the restaurant Supermania. You will hear that William Brown did see a boy running away with a violin. However, you will also hear that it was dark backstage and noisy because everyone was clapping. After you've thought about that setting, think about the restaurant. You are going to hear from one of the waiters at the Supermania restaurant. He remembers seeing Andy at the time of the crime because he caused a big commotion about a fly in his suit. This witness, David Ryman, will tell you that Andy caused a huge racket. After you've heard Mr. Ryman's testimony, you will know that there is no way he could have been mistaken. Something else that you will hear is that Barry, Andy's brother, was performing at the concert that night, and Andy had said that he might be there. You will hear that Kate McGee, who is Andy and Barry's mom, was, in fact, looking for Andy, but she never saw him come in the door. She will tell you that she really wanted Andy to be there, so she was looking for him carefully, but she never saw him. Mrs. Sood told you about Sam Briggs and made a big deal about his testimony. Well, listen closely to Sam's testimony. You will hear that Sam Briggs had a very big grudge on Andy, and therefore would have a reason to lie. Once Andy tripped Sam on the way to the bathroom, and whether it was on purpose or an accident, it doesn't matter. But the evidence will show that Sam has been holding it against Andy ever since. After you've heard this testimony, you will understand why Sam might lie to get Andy in trouble and get his revenge. After you've heard all of the evidence, you will know that Andy McGee is not guilty. To get the new watch, he spent $400 of the $500 that his grandfather gave him. He had no reason to steal the violin. He didn't steal it, and he wasn't even there. Andy McGee is not guilty.
Thank you, Ms. Perelic. Prosecution, call your first witness.
The people call Grace Johnson.
Okay, raise your right hand. Promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Grace Johnson. Johnson.
How old are you?
I'm 13.
Where do you go to school?
Longfellow Middle School.
What grade are you in?
I'm in 8th grade.
Do you play an instrument?
Yes.
What is that instrument?
I play the violin.
How long have you played the violin?
I've played since I was 6 years old.
Where did you get the violin?
From a store.
Did you get it with anybody?
Yes.
Who did you get it with?
I got it with my grandmother.
How much did it cost?
It cost $400.
How did you get the money to pay for it?
I used all my babysitting money.
Is there any other reason this violin is special?
Yes. My grandmother died a year before, so whenever I play it, I think of her.
Do you remember the night of February 24th, 2014?
Yes.
What happened?
It was the Longfellow Middle School concert.
How did you participate in the concert?
I played the violin.
Where had you put your violin?
I put my violin backstage with everyone else's instrument
Why did you put your violin there?
because everyone else did.
Did you know the man backstage?
No.
Did you ask him any questions?
Yes.
What did he say?
Well, I asked him, when I went backstage, I saw that my violin was missing. So I asked him if he saw anything. Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
Ms. Kwan?
Good evening, Miss Johnson.
Good evening.
You performed at the concert on the 24th of February.
Yes.
You performed at about 8 p.m.
Yes.
When it was your turn to perform, you went backstage
Yes.
to get your violin.
Yes.
But when you went backstage, you couldn't find it.
Yes.
It was very cluttered when you were backstage.
Yes.
There were instruments all over the place.
Yes.
It was hard to see.
Sorta.
There was not a lot of light.
No.
There was a guy back there working.
Yes.
You asked the guy if he saw anything.
Yes.
The guy was sweating, wasn't he?
Yes.
He looked really busy.
Yes.
And you said that he saw someone running away with your violin.
Yes.
But you did not see the person who took the violin.
No.
So you don't know whether Andy McGee is the boy who took the violin.
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Prosecution will call the next witness.
People call William Brown.
Good evening, Mr. Brown.
Good evening.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
William Brown. Brown.
How old are you?
I am 17.
Do you go to school?
Yes.
What grade are you in?
I'm a senior at Berkeley High.
Where did you go to middle school?
Longfellow?
Did you participate in the music program when you were at Longfellow?
Yes.
Do you ever help out at the Longfellow musical performances?
Yes.
What kind of things do you help out with?
I help out backstage with the instruments and the chairs. Backstage.
Do you have to be quiet?
Yes.
Now I'd like to ask you some questions about the night of February 24th. Did Longfellow have a concert that night?
Yes.
Were you working that night?
Yes.
What were you doing?
I was working backstage.
Where did the performers keep their instruments?
Backstage?
Did anything out of the ordinary happen that night at Longfellow?
Yes.
What happened?
Somebody came backstage and took a violin.
Was it a boy or a girl?
It was a boy.
Did you see the boy's face?
No.
Did he say anything?
Yes.
Did you recognize him?
Yes.
What did he say?
He said, "Ah," before running away.
So it was quiet enough for you to hear a small noise and turn around?
Yes.
Did you recognize his voice?
Yes.
Did you know his name?
Not at the time, no.
At some point, did the police contact you?
Yes.
What did they ask you?
They showed me a picture of a kid named Andy McGee and asked me if this was the person who took the violin.
Do you see the boy you saw backstage in the courtroom today?
Yes.
Can you point him out and describe what he's wearing?
He's in a gray suit.
Let the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant, Andy McGee. No further questions.
Ms. Blankenhouse?
You're a senior at Berkeley High.
Yes.
You like to play trombone.
Yes.
And you like to help out at the performances at Longfellow.
Yes.
Because you used to go there.
Yes.
And because you like the music program at Longfellow.
Yes.
The band leader, Mr. Merrick, always lets you come in and help whenever you can, right?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about the concert on February 24th, 2014. You were working at the concert on February 24th, correct?
Yes.
You had a job,
Yes.
and your job was to get all the kids ready for each act.
Yes.
You were also responsible for organizing everything backstage.
Yes.
That's a lot of work, isn't it?
Yes.
And you took it seriously,
Yes.
because you wanted to help out Mr. Merrick, the band leader.
Yes.
Now, when you were moving a chair, you saw a kid, right?
Yes.
You saw him take a violin.
Yes.
At the time you saw him take the violin, it was between two acts, right?
Yes.
There was a lot of clapping in the auditorium
Yes.
because an act had just ended.
Yes.
So it was pretty noisy.
Yes.
And it was also dark backstage.
Yes.
There was not a lot of light in the room.
Yes.
Now, the boy you saw, he ran as soon as you saw him.
Yes.
And you didn't hear him talking, did you?
I heard him say one word, but otherwise no.
You just heard him scream, ah.
Yes.
A few days later, a policeman came to talk to you
Yes.
and showed you a picture of Andy McGee, correct?
Yes.
The police only showed you one picture, though.
Yes.
They didn't take you to a lineup where you got to see lots of possible suspects.
Yes.
They just showed you the picture of Andy McGee.
Yes.
And you didn't even know Andy's name when they showed you the picture, did you?
Yeah.
And again, it was hard to see.
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Prosecution will call the next witness.
The people call Sam Briggs. Good morning, Mr. Briggs.
Good morning.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Sam Briggs, Briggs.
How old are you?
I'm 18.
Are you in school?
Yes.
What grade are you in?
I'm a senior.
What school do you go to?
Berkeley High.
Do you know Andy McGee?
Yes.
How do you know him?
He's in a lot of my classes.
Do you sometimes see him out on the yard during lunch?
Yes.
Are you aware that Andy wanted to get a new watch?
Yes.
How do you know that?
I heard him say that he thought up a foolproof plan to get some money for a watch.
Did you ever... When was this?
Early February.
Where were you when you heard the conversation?
In the cafeteria.
What exactly did you hear Andy say?
I thought up a foolproof plan to get some money for a watch.
Did one of his friends ask him what the plan was?
Yes, they asked him. He said, "I'm just glad I have a little brother in a Longfellow band."
Did that make any sense to you?
No.
At some point, did you see Andy with a new watch?
Yes.
When was this?
February 26th.
What did Andy say about the watch?
It cost $400.
How long after the conversation about the plan to get the watch did you see Andy with a new watch?
About a week.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Perolic.
Good evening, Mr. Briggs. Good evening. I am going to ask you a few questions. On February 26, 2014, you saw Andy McGee bragging about his fancy new watch.
Yes.
So you know he got a new watch. Yeah. But you have no idea where he got the money to buy the new watch, do you?
Yeah.
You weren't with him when he bought it.
No.
You didn't see him buy it?
No.
He never told you where he got the money from?
Yeah.
So really, you have no idea where he got the money from?
Yeah.
Now, you try and get good grades in class.
Yes.
Because doing well in school is important to you.
Yes.
You want to go to a good college?
Yes.
And you find it hard to concentrate when other kids are goofing off in class.
Yes.
Andy McGee goofs off in class, doesn't he?
Yes.
And he is always loud in class when you are trying to work.
Yes.
When you are trying to work, you want Andy to be quiet?
Yes.
It's annoying to you when he is being loud in class, isn't it?
Yes.
You don't like it? Once he tripped you on the way to the bathroom, am I right?
Yes.
You fell flat on your face?
Yes.
It hurt?
Yes.
It was embarrassing?
Yes.
And you were mad at him for doing that?
Yeah.
You're still mad, aren't you?
A little bit.
You and Andy aren't friends.
Yeah.
You
don't like Andy McGee very much, do you? Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Prosecutor, call the next witness.
The people rest, Your Honor.
Thank you. Very well, the court will take a short 3-minute recess.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while the court is in recess.
Oh my gosh. Guys? Okay, guys, when I was on stage, I was like, literally, I felt so warm. Sorry. Literally, feel my cheeks. I have to call it. Because I didn't.
Not as hot.
Guys, when I went up on stage, I was reading the paper, and I was like, and then finished with my witness, and I'm allowed to say
And if they say you're innocent, what do they do?
Then we all saw
We're gonna win.
All right, court back in session. The Honorable Demetrius Agratellis presiding.
Does the defense have any witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Kate McGee.
Raise your right hand. Promise to tell the truth. truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Yes. Good evening, Miss McGee.
Good evening.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Kate McGee, McGee.
Thank you. Do you know Andy McGee?
Yes.
How do you know him?
He's my son.
What grade is he in?
He's a senior.
And what school does he go to?
Berkeley High.
Do you know Barry McGee?
Yes.
How do you know him?
He's also my son.
What grade is he in?
He's a 7th grader.
And what school does he go to?
Longfellow.
Is Andy Barry's older brother?
Yes.
How is your relationship with Andy?
Strong. I love him a lot.
Do you think that he would commit this crime?
No.
Would you lie to protect your son?
No.
Now I want to ask you a few questions about the evening of February 24th. Do you remember that evening?
Yes.
Where were you?
I was at Barry's performance at Longfellow.
Did Andy come to Barry's performance?
No.
How do you know?
I was looking for him.
Why were you looking for Andy?
Because Barry really enjoys it when he comes.
Did you see Andy at all that night?
No.
Do you know where Andy was?
No.
Do Barry and Andy have a grandfather?
Yes.
Is he your father?
Yes.
Does he do the lottery?
Yes.
Has he ever won money?
Yes.
When did he win?
A few days before the concert.
And how much money did he win?
$1,000.
What did he do with the money?
He gave half of it to Barry and the other half to Andy.
What did Andy do with the money?
He bought a new watch.
Why do you think he spent it on watch?
Because the next day he came home with a watch.
How long after Andy got the money did you notice he had the new watch?
A few days.
Thank you. No further questions.
Ms. Whitehill?
You are Andy's mom, right?
Yes.
You love and care for him.
Yes.
It was a big concert, right?
Yes.
A lot of students were performing,
Yes.
including your son Barry.
Yes.
And the auditorium holds hundreds of people.
Yes.
The auditorium was basically full.
Yes.
It would be hard to keep track of everyone in there.
Yes.
It would be easy to miss someone.
Yeah, I guess.
You said Andy's grandfather won some money.
Yes.
You don't know what the money was spent on, right?
No.
Andy's grandfather got the money before the concert,
Yes.
and he got the watch after the concert,
Yes.
after the violin was stolen.
Yes.
You don't want your son to go to jail, do you?
No.
No further questions.
Defense will call the next witness.
Defense calls David Ryman.
Promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Good evening, Mr. Ryman.
Good evening.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
David Ryman.
Thank you.
Ryman.
Thank you. Do you have a job?
Yes.
Where do you work?
I work at Supamania.
What kind of restaurant is Supamania?
We serve lots of soups.
I see you're wearing glasses today.
Yes.
Do you wear them when you're working?
No.
Why don't you wear your glasses when you're working?
Because they get all sweaty and fall down on my face.
Now I want to ask you a couple of questions about the night on February 24th, 2014.
Okay.
On the night of the 24th, were you working at your restaurant?
Yes.
What shift were you working?
6 o'clock to 9 o'clock.
Did something memorable happen that night?
Yes.
What happened?
The customer got really angry at me.
Let's take it one step at a time. First, what did the customer order?
He ordered a chicken noodle soup.
How did he behave after you gave him the soup?
He was really mad at me.
Was he yelling at you?
Yes.
Did you offer to give him more soup?
Yes, I did.
About what time did this happen?
It happened at about 8 o'clock.
How do you know what time it was?
I keep a watch on.
Do you see the boy who was yelling at you that night?
Yes.
Can you point him out to the jury and describe what he is wearing?
Gray suit.
Let the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant, Andy McGee. Are you sure that Andy McGee is the boy you saw at the restaurant?
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Ms. Beshara Walker?
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm going to ask you a few questions about what you saw the night of February 24th.
Okay.
You work at Supermania in Berkeley, right?
Yes.
It's a restaurant
Yes.
that mainly serves soup.
Yep.
The restaurant is always really busy, right?
Yes.
And crowded
Yes.
and noisy.
Yes.
Now, on the night of February 24th, a customer made a big commotion, right?
Yes.
And you claim that that boy is Andy McGee?
Yes.
The boy sitting right here?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about that. The boy complained to you that there was a fly in his soup, right? You serve a lot of customers each night, right?
Yes.
And most of them are strangers to you, right?
Yep.
But you claim to be able to identify this customer because he said there was a fly in his soup, correct?
Correct.
Isn't it true that a lot of customers at Supermania complain?
Yes.
And specifically, they complain about flies in their soup, correct? This was not the first time someone had complained about a fly in their soup, right?
Yes.
It happens all the time, doesn't it? Yes. Now, Mr. Ryman, I see you're wearing glasses.
Yes.
But you weren't wearing them that night, were you?
No, I was not.
And you weren't wearing contact lenses either, right?
No.
Because you don't like how they feel?
Yes.
So you couldn't see everything as clearly as you would with glasses, right?
No, I couldn't.
No further questions.
Defense calls Ryan Walters.
You promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Please state your name and spell your last name for the record.
Ryan Walters, Walters.
And how old are you, Mr. Walters?
18.
And what school do you go to?
Berkeley High.
What grade are you in?
12.
And do you know Sam Briggs?
Yes.
How do you know him?
I go to school with him.
Do you spend time with him outside of school?
Yes.
And have you spent time with him before you went to school with him?
Yes.
And what time was that?
In middle school.
Do you know Andy McGee?
Yes.
How do you know him, Mr. Walters?
I go to school with him.
Does Sam Briggs know Andy McGee?
Yes.
And what relationship do they have with each other?
They can't stand each other.
And how does Sam express those feelings towards Andy?
He just complains about it a lot.
And what are the reasons Sam does complain about Andy?
He goofs off in class and he tripped him on the way to the bathroom. Sam.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Graham?
Good evening.
Good evening.
You have known Sam Briggs for a long time, right?
Yes.
You think Sam is really annoying?
Yes.
Sam thinks Andy tripped him.
Yes.
This was almost 2 years ago.
Yes.
Sam still won't shut up about it.
Yes.
That gets annoying for you, right?
Yes.
You think Sam should get over it.
Yes.
You walk home with Sam?
Yes.
Only because he lives around the corner.
Yes.
You can't really stand Sam, can you?
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
Does the defense have any further witnesses at this time?
No, Your Honor. The defense rests.
Thank you. Very well. Members of the jury, that concludes the evidence in this case. We will take another short recess to allow the lawyers to prepare for their closing arguments. The court will stand in recess for 3 minutes.
This court is now in recess for 3 minutes. Please stay in your seats while the court is in recess. We will resume the trial in 3 minutes.
Please state your name. He said, I said David and I said thank you. I mean, you did all right. Okay, so I do it this slow, right? I totally relaxed, and then he said David and I said thank you. And he
I said, why don't you wear your glasses when you're working?
You want it for food? Is it even working? Check, check. It works. Quietly. I'm just gonna do this.
Take your seats.
Okay.
Lawyers, please take your seats, and jury, you too. This court is now in session. The Honorable Demetrius Agratel is presiding.
Counsel, are you ready for your closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ms. Bishop? Thank you. Ms. Bishop Walker, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
In just a minute, the defense is going to come up here and say that Andy McGee was never at the Longfellow Theater the night of February 24th.
They want you to believe that on the night of February 24th, Andy McGee was at Supermania while the performance at Longfellow was going on. And, okay, they might be right, at least partly. But they're going to cherry pick the information. They're not going to tell you the whole truth. The whole truth is really very simple. Here's a quick overview of the 4 main facts of the case. Number 1, it was common knowledge that Andy McGee wanted a new fancy watch. He was seen at school telling his friends about it and how he had a plan. Number 2, on the night of February 24th, Andy put his plan into action. Andy snuck backstage at Longfellow and snatched Grace Johnson's violin. Unfortunately for Andy, William Brown saw him. Andy got caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and Andy ran. 3, where did Andy go? We don't know. He could have gone right back home and no one would have noticed because they were at the Longfellow performance. He could have dashed over to the kids' local hangout, Supermania, stashed the violin under the table, and deliberately caused a huge commotion to create an alibi. But we don't know. Finally, what we do know is that 2 days later, Andy showed up with a new fancy watch. Andy had his $400 watch, and Grace's $400 violin was gone. Okay. Now we're going to look at each scene with a little more detail. Number 1, Andy McGee had a motive. He wanted a new fancy watch. Even Andy's mother admits that he was always talking about wanting one. And Sam Briggs told you Andy was obsessed with getting a fancy watch. You heard Sam Briggs tell you that he overheard Andy telling his friends about it at lunch and how he had a plan connected to the middle school band. The defense will probably say that just because he wanted a fancy watch doesn't mean he stole the violin. And that's fine. We don't have to prove it. I'm just telling you this now so you'll understand what Andy's motive was. Number 2, we have a very credible eyewitness, William Brown. William Brown saw Andy grab Grace Johnson's violin that night. Just like Jack and Beanstalk sneaking into the Giant's castle, Andy snuck backstage at Longfellow. But instead of grabbing a magic harp, he snatched Grace Johnson's violin. But just as Andy was reaching over, William Brown heard a small sound and looked, and saw Andy grabbing the violin. And when Andy realized that William Brown saw him, he screamed, and he grabbed the violin, and then he ran. Now, the defense is going to say that it was too chaotic in there. They're going to say it was dark. They're going to say that it was noisy. But in fact, it was quiet enough for William Brown to be alerted when he heard just a small sound. And he heard Andy yell. Not only did William Brown recognize Andy's face, but he also recognized Andy's voice. Then, when Grace Johnson came up to him and asked him if he knew where her violin was, he told her exactly what he saw without hesitation. William Brown knows Andy McGee from school. He knows Andy McGee's face. He knows Andy McGee's voice. William Brown is confident of what he saw and of what he heard. William Brown is an extremely credible witness. Number 3. Now, this is where Andy runs out of the Longfellow Theater, and we don't know where he went. But we have 2 possibilities. Let's look at possibility number 1, that Andy could have just run home without anyone noticing. Because even though David Ryman says he saw Andy at the restaurant, doesn't necessarily mean that Andy was really there. Because Mr. Ryman has pretty bad eyesight, and he needs glasses. But he wasn't wearing them that night. He wasn't wearing contact lenses either. And Mr. Ryman says he remembers Andy in particular because he had a fly in his suit and threw a big tantrum. But then he says there have been a lot of customers lately complaining about flies. And with his blurry eyesight and so many customers, how do we know he's not confusing them? But now, the second possibility is that, okay, maybe David Ryman is right. Maybe Andy did go to Supermania when he realized William Brown saw him stealing the violin. Andy could have run to Supermania and tried to get noticed, to establish an alibi. But so what? Either way, it doesn't affect the outcome of the case, and I'll show you why. Let's look closely at the timeline. We know that sometime before 8 p.m., Andy steals the violin. How do we know this? Because Grace Johnson testifies that she came in at about 8 p.m., and Andy was long gone at that point, so it must have been before 8 p.m. that the theft occurred. Then, at about 8 p.m., Grace tells us she comes backstage. Then, also at about 8 p.m., which is simultaneous with Grace appearing backstage, David Ryman says Andy finally shows up at Supermania. So Andy still could have had time to steal the violin before Grace Johnson appeared, and then run to the restaurant to make his alibi at about 8 p.m. Number 4. Andy's situation created the opportunity to commit this crime. I'm not blaming Andy's mother for what her son did. Andy did it himself. But Andy comes to school 2 days later with a fancy watch. And just like Jack and the Beanstalk's mother didn't ask any questions about where the bag of gold came from, Andy's mother doesn't ask any questions either. In fact, she doesn't seem to ask too many questions ever. She didn't even know where he was the night of the crime and spent quite a while running around looking for him. She never asked where Andy goes on school nights, and she never asked where the money for the watch came from. Sure, she says she heard that Andy's grandfather might be giving him some money, but did she actually bother to find out if he really did? No, she did not. She just assumed. I don't know about you, but if I thought my son was going to get a large sum of money, I'd be asking questions about his plans for spending it. And if my son was going out at night, I'd be asking where he was going. And if my son suddenly showed up with a very expensive watch, I'd be asking questions about where it came from. I wouldn't just assume. Unless maybe I didn't want to know the truth. Finally, the question before you is not whether Andy did or did not go to Supermania that night. The question is whether or not you believe William Brown. If you believe William Brown, you must find Andy McGee guilty. The defense won't tell you any of this. This is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Blankenhouse?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Now that you have heard all the evidence in this case, you have many reasons to doubt that Andy McGee is guilty. In fact, Ms. Perolik told you at the beginning of this case, you now know that Mr. McGee is an innocent boy who was nowhere near the Longfellow Auditorium when poor Grace Johnson's violin got stolen. Andy McGee is not guilty of stealing Grace Johnson's violin. The judge has told you that if you have any reason to doubt whether Mr. McGee is guilty, you must find him not guilty. A reason to doubt is a doubt that you can give a reason for. Here, there are many reasons to doubt. Let's go through them. One of the witnesses, William Brown, said that he recognized Andy's voice when he screamed. But how could William have recognized Andy's voice when he just heard Andy scream, "Ah"? Maybe William could have recognized Andy if he had seen his face clearly, but he didn't. We know that it was loud and noisy backstage. Yes, William saw a person holding a violin and running away, but that is not evidence that Andy stole the violin. It was also very dark and noisy backstage because it was a transition between two acts. So Andy could not clearly have seen or heard the person who stole Grace's violin. Next, we have heard from Sam Briggs. He claims that he heard some crazy plan Andy thought up to steal a violin in order to buy a watch. Does that make any sense to you, ladies and gentlemen? Maybe it does not make any sense, because it didn't happen. We only have Sam Briggs' word, and you can't trust Sam Briggs' word because he is biased. Sam testified that Andy is always goofing off in class, and Andy tripped him on the way to the bathroom. He hates Andy and has been waiting to get revenge on him ever since that day. He thinks Andy tripped him, and this is his chance. We also have Ryan Walters, who is a friend of Sam Briggs. Ryan testifies that Andy has no proof it was on purpose or that it even happened. Now let's talk about where Andy really was that night. There is the evidence that Andy was at the restaurant called Supermania at the exact time that the concert was going on. If Andy was at the restaurant at the time the concert was going on, how could he have stolen the violin? Put yourselves in the waiter's shoes. If a teenager came into a restaurant and started yelling at you really loudly just because they had a fly in his soup, I think I would remember it. I know I would. Some people might say that the waiter was not wearing his glasses, so he could not have seen the board clearly. But to be a waiter, you have to see clearly enough to be able to work, which means that David Ryman's eyesight couldn't have been that bad. The evidence showed that Andy got his new fancy watch from the $500 that his grandfather won from the lottery. And again, we all know that Andy got his fancy watch from the money his grandfather gave him and not from Grace Johnson's violin. Andy McGee is definitely not guilty of stealing Grace Johnson's violin to buy his fancy new watch. Thank you.
Thank you. Members of the jury, you must now decide if Andy McGee is guilty or not guilty of theft. To prove that the defendant is guilty of this crime, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Andy McGee, unlawfully took the personal property of another person and that the property was worth more than $250. The fact that a criminal charge has been filed against the defendant is not evidence that the charge is true. A defendant is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires that the prosecution prove a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As I told you before, proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you very sure that the charge is true. The evidence does not have to eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. But unless the evidence proves the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find him not guilty. It is also important that you base your decision on the evidence you have just heard and not based on whether you are friends with any of the lawyers or witnesses. I understand that Ms. Oliver is the foreperson of the jury. Ms. Oliver will lead you in a discussion of the evidence, making sure that each person gets to state his or her opinion. Please keep an open mind as your fellow jurors speak. When you are done deliberating, please take a vote to determine whether Mr. McGee is guilty or not guilty. You may now deliberate, and this court will stand in recess.
The jury will now deliberate for no more than 10 minutes. You are welcome to watch them deliberate or go out into the lobby. Court will reconvene in no more than 10 minutes.
Are we allowed to go out into the lobby?
Here's the new
Very good.
When we win, when we win, I'm allowed to wear the glasses. Yeah, no, I am. No, we are. Wait, stop. Hey, Logan, try to move this. Harder, try to move this.
Decided that he would give it to them. I decided to go on but I haven't finished it.
What are you doing?
Remember, it doesn't really matter who wins.
If one person votes on our side, it's a tie.
That's true. Wait, are you the defense? All the defense teams just win votes. Yeah, you're right.
If one person votes for the defense, it's a tie. I don't care. Listen, why? Win. Logan looks too bad at him. What did you do? Right now, Baker's over though. Logan looks You look terrible. I want to see Louis. Her style. You got him style. You look good.
I still look better. I look better.
I want to wear it.
It's 100 either way. Who gets 11-1 and then they try the case over again. Usually people say sometimes
The king of the world.
but it's always been a chance to get 100, but in the second trial, you think good to see. We're going to come back pretty soon.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, she's smiling. She's smiling.
Please take your seats. Please take your seats. Hey, prosecutors, please take your seats. Prosecutors, please take your seats. Thank you. Okay. Please take your seats. This court is now in session.
Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
And what is your verdict?
We think that Andy McGee is guilty.
Thank you. Members of the jury, thank you for your service as jurors, and thank you to all of the attorneys and to the witnesses who participated in this proceeding today. I'd like to say a couple of things about this proceeding. Two words come to mind after presiding over this trial. In my former life, I presided over real trials downtown. But the two words that come to my mind after presiding over this trial are excellent and awesome. I would like to note and pay special thanks to some people who put a lot of time and effort into this, putting this proceeding together, namely the coaches and the assistant coaches. The coaches, as you probably know, are Ty Alper, James Stevens, and Rachel Alper. And oh, by the way, Rachel Alper was also my bailiff, who maintained order in this courtroom throughout. The assistant coaches were Roxanne Reyes, Naomi Barrios, and Zoe Pancoast. Would the coaches and the assistant coaches please stand up so that the audience can see you? And how about a hand for the attorneys on both sides? Well done, well done, counsel. And that concludes the evening. My bailiff will have an announcement.
Ladies and gentlemen, this court stands in recess. Please proceed to the lobby outside the courtroom for a reception. Thank you. Oh, upstairs. Just kidding.